Is liberal condescension pushing Americans further from the liberal agenda? According to a new op-ed in the New York Times, yes. University of Virginia political science professor Gerard Alexander argues, quote, liberals are trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle. When they use their positions in American culture to lecture, judge, and disdain, they push more people into an opposing coalition that liberals are increasingly prone to think of as deplorable. Alexander continues arguing liberals are making President Trump's re-election in 2020 more likely, but he says it's not too late to stop. And Gerard joins me now from our Washington bureau to discuss his article. Gerard, thanks so much for being with us. Let's start with the headline. Who specifically are the liberals you're writing about, and why aren't they as smart as they think they are?
I don't mean to put down the editorial process at all when I say that op-ed writers never pick their own titles. I think I would have preferred to go with something like liberals, you're not as persuasive as you think they are. The article focuses on liberals who do tend to populate America's leading legacy media institutions, American cultural institutions like Hollywood and TV production, and universities, which means that they dominate the faculties that all of our kids and cousins, attend classes in. They are up on the Oscar stage. They write the lines that, best actors and best actresses speak and things like that. And what I'm talking about is a tone that I think a lot of liberals, completely unaware, adopt that can be incredibly off-putting for a lot of their fellow citizens. I really don't think they mean to do it. They're just acting out their principles and their desire that I think all groups have to educate, to evangelize, if you know what I mean,
right,
to just encourage others to have their views. And they don't realize how often their tone and exact choices push other people away.
Well, so you're saying that this sort of sanctimony and the self-righteousness is always off-putting. I just have a question for you about how you would suggest liberals and progressives go about their agenda, because just bear with me for a moment. I mean, the sort of basis of liberal or progressive thought is trying to identify social injustices and change them, right? And it's hard to do that without making people uncomfortable. I mean, certainly the civil rights movement wasn't done politely. So how would you recommend liberals then go about addressing real social injustices?
Right. Oh, so I'm not talking about not pursuing, certain policy goals that matter. For instance, I don't think Obamacare, which was meant to, address how many Americans don't have health insurance, I don't think that's an act of superiority or condescension. That's simply pursuing a public policy of the kind that groups of the left and right always have in America. I'm talking more approaches to how they literally talk. So, for instance, the notion of allowing an Oscars ceremony to become a forum for what seems to be, lecturing people who are their social inferiors. The way it can come across, even though it's not only might not be meant that way, I'm sure it's not meant that way. I just gave the example a moment ago of regulating one's own speech and explaining why you're doing it, but not trying to literally ban words from coming out of someone else's mouth.
Right.
Let me give you one example, one more. So I happen to be favorable to what used to be loosely called gay rights, to same-sex marriage rights, and I was in that sense very happy when the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court a couple of years ago affirmed that right for Americans. But forces that had fought for that litigation, that suit, that decision, very quickly proceeded to try to, I would say, chase down obscure caterers across America who had expressed a reluctance to cater same-sex weddings. Now, I understand the arguments about why they thought that was a good public policy thing to pursue and why those lawsuits made sense to them, but it seemed to me that that was a fight that could easily have been avoided. Those were fights they didn't need to pick, that the payoff from them was very modest, and the reason to avoid it is because it felt like they were saying the answer yes wasn't good enough from the Supreme Court. We now have to shove this down the throats of everybody who might be reluctant to comply with it or to respect it in some deeper sense. And I just think that's the kind of fight that just does not need to be picked. That's not a really serious social injustice.
Well, I guess that's in the eye of the beholder. There would be some that would consider that a serious social injustice. There's a little bit of an opinion there.
Sure, but my point is their opinion, the opinion of those who believe that every one of those fights is worth picking, is costing them. And it comes with price tags. That's my point. I know these are opinions. You're absolutely right. But this is advice about which tactics make the most sense. And I think some tactics that might be justified on their legal merits or on their moral merits often backfire. And we want to be careful with those.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. But there is also plenty of name calling and ridicule from the right towards the left. You know, feminazis, snowflakes, PC police. You know, so does this have the same effect on the other side? And if so, why make your op-ed only about liberals and not about the state of political discourse in general?
Sure, that it applies to conservatives in spades. I mean, there's more than enough self-defeating foolishness around in this country to go around, just as you're suggesting. I wrote this because in the wake of the White House Correspondents' Dinner and the sort of tone that many detected there, I thought it was a good time to write about the liberals who have this unique platform of a whole series of cultural institutions in which they are so predominant. Their voices are very hard to escape. And I think they often live in environments where those are the voices they hear, and in that sense, I think it just breeds a lack of awareness of that. Whereas I know very few conservatives who don't know sooner or later what CBS News or New York Times has to report on some issue, or what Meryl Streep might have said from the Oscar stage. It's very hard for them to avoid that. And in that sense, I think they do hear conflicting voices. But you're right; they're not always very open to them, or tolerant of them, or friendly to them.
And at this moment in time, the conservative voices are actually the ones in power.
They're in the White House and they're in Congress, but I think that's not the same as what we hear when flipping around channels on a random night. A lot of people don't. I hate to say this in a newsroom and while I'm on the news, but a lot of people don't watch the news. What they do is, you know, sort of have a sense of what George Clooney might think about something, or watch a movie or TV show in which values are expressed, or for instance, I mean, be aware of, you know, the kind of commentary that was going on with the NFL, the kneeling during the anthem. That's something that literally almost no American didn't talk about or wasn't aware of. And those cultural things, those penetrate virtually every single household in America in a way in which, you know, political statements don't always.
Right. Now, in response to your article, there's been lots of responses to your article, but one of them from CBS News political analyst and Slate magazine chief political correspondent Jamel Bowie, he tweeted that the argument he thinks you perhaps want to make is that, quote, liberals deserve what they get when they suggest anyone might be responsible for racism. In other words, if somebody says something racist, can't we call it out as racist?
Yes, I absolutely do, and I really do reject Mr. Bowie's point. I think the problem becomes, what do we call racist? And one of the greatest divisions in America today is between progressives and liberals who are convinced that a very wide range of points of view and activities and behaviors should properly be called racist, and conservatives who find that very exaggerated and very offensive to them. And I don't know how to reconcile those, because notice, I think you've touched on the most important, the most complicated part of this conversation I'm trying to evoke or trying to encourage, which is that the most difficult of them is not a nice, neat formula like regulate your speech but not someone else's. It's how do you decide what is racist and deserves to be called out just for that, as opposed to someone else who disagrees with you, that the line is being drawn in the wrong place. And that's going to require a lot more than an op-ed to resolve.
Absolutely. Well, University of Virginia political science professor Gerard Alexander, thank you for your time.
Thank you.